Thank you so much, Eddie. What a pleasure having you here on the podcast, The X Months Drive. How have you been today?
Everything is wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. What a joy to be here.
Pleasure is always mine. Having read the kind of work that you do, having heard you on several occasions, be it ICF conference or different webinars, always wanted to have you on the podcast. So finally, the day is here. Such a pleasure.
Yes, yes. And I'm a big fan of your work and what your organization is doing and the prodigious footprint you have established across the globe. Quite a thing of joy to see. I really admire what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Eddie, the world knows you as one of the finest professional speakers. The world knows you as one of the authorities when it comes to executive coaching. The world knows you as one of the top 10 motivational speakers in the world. Just want to know, Eddie, how would you define yourself without your titles?
As a husband, as a father, a
Mhm.
son who loves people, who's a man
Mm.
of faith and principle, I think that's really who I am at my core.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And, if you may share one of those early memories from your childhood that brings a smile on your face today as well.
That's always my mom. I was fortunate to have my mom and my dad for perhaps the first 13, 14 years of my life.
Mhm.
And my dad alive until I think I was about 30 when he died. But
Mm.
yeah, so my earliest memories are just I say my mom first because she was the one who read to me every night. And I say that a lot of what I was able to go on to accomplish came from fundamentally from reading. And so
Mm.
to this day, that remains something that's important to me. And even with my own children, this is the idea of being able to read is really important. And it's because of her. My dad, I
Mm.
learned a lot of other things from, a lot of life lessons. But I think it all starts with your ability to communicate.
And any specific lesson that you have learned from your dad, I can understand that you have picked up reading from your mother. Anything from your
With my
dad
dad, it
that you
would have
may
been
want to
more
mention?
disciplined, very much
Mm.
the disciplinarian, very much perhaps structure. And I became a perfectionist probably as a result. I had to work on that
Mm.
later on. But yeah, that did hold me in good stead.
Yeah. And I can actually see both the traits in you, be it someone who reads a lot, of course, you read a lot, you write a lot of blogs, all the work that you do is so well researched. And of course, the disciplinarian and the perfectionist. I have encountered that a few times for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Eddie, you do a lot of work with different organizations in the world. You work with multi-generational workforces in the organizations. Just curious, what makes it important for today's leaders to understand the need for multi-generational coaching?
Multi-generational coaching is important for today's leaders because for the first time ever, there are five generations
Mm.
of employees in the workforce.
Mm.
And that's according to Harvard Business Review. Now, there was a time that you didn't necessarily have to be concerned about different perspectives from a different generation as you and as much as you did now. But when you have that much of a span, where you have people who are born perhaps in 1920s and 30s in the workforce, and those who are born in later years, there's different expectations, there's
Mm.
different demands, and if not properly handled and kept in balance, it can create a real tension and friction.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing the word friction and tension. Just for everyone's benefit, the audience who are listening to us right now, just putting some data in place so that we'll be able to relate to that. You know, in today's conversation, we are going to dig deeper into coaching and, of course, multi-generational coaching. So when we're talking multi-generational coaching, AD just mentioned that on an average, as per Harvard Business Review, on an average, five generations are working today in the same organization. Let's start with different generations that we are going to explore today. Generation A, what we call as the battery generation, is people who were born after 2013. Generation Z is 1997 to 2012. Generation Y is 1981 to 1996. And then we have got Generation X as well, 1965 to 80, and Generation, what we call as baby boomers, 1946 to 64. Before that, we call them the greatest generations. So this is what we're going to dwell deeper into. You know, Eddie, you spoke about friction and tension. And that's one thing that I genuinely want to ask you. But before we get into that space, very curious to understand. On one hand, when we're talking about it's really important, what makes it important for today's leaders to understand that so that we know that they are multi generations working in an organization to reduce the friction, to reduce the tension, it becomes more and more important for us to understand that we have to navigate our path through that. What do you think? What are the primary changes in their needs or their desires or their expectations that you have observed in working with different generations in an organization?
There are several.
Hmm.
The first I perhaps would mention is what it means to be led in an organization. When you have come from the generation that has the mindset that leadership is a command control proposition.
Hmm.
And that is largely in part because, for example, when you're talking about the greatest generation, those born 1924 or earlier, and that phrase comes from Tom Brokaw, famous American journalist Tom Brokaw, who called them that because of what they went through, that generation that saw World War One, followed by traditionalists, the generation that saw World War Two. And so the military concept of leadership is top down. And the person with the most stripes on their garment is the unquestionable authority.
Yeah.
And therefore, what they say goes. Well, today's generation, when you're talking about the millennial generation or the battery generation, we call them that because the battery generation, everything's always been digital for them. They're not going to just do something because you said so. They're not going to subscribe to your way of thinking because you're older, more experienced. They have the attitude, you got to prove it to me. You've got to explain it to me. And so just that fundamental difference of what is leadership, what is good leadership, and how you should be led or be leading is a prime example of what we're talking about here.
I can so much relate to that because at one point in time, when my parents told me that this is what you should be doing, without even questioning them, I will do as being asked from me. And if I ask something to the next generation, which is today's generation, as we're talking about the battery generations, right? Or they would ask me, hey, tell me, what is the scientific reason for doing that? It's like a few days back, I was in one of those prayers, and the lead pandit, the preacher, asked us to cover our head and sit in a particular position. And most of us sat. One of the generation that comes from the battery generation, this young girl, she must be in the first year of her education. She asked that priest, hey, why are you asking me to cover my head? What is the reason behind that? And she would not say yes to that unless the priest is willing to give her a scientific reason. She continued to chase that. And that is one of those shifts that even I have observed from command to control to a moving into why are you asking me to do something? And of course, there are a lot of other differences as well that we are going to explore as we move on, Eddie. Eddie, I'm just wondering, what are the other different ways that could help us, that could help a team member determine what each generation expect from the organization, what each generation expect from the leader. As you mentioned, there are five different generations working in an organization. So is there any thermometer, stethoscope that could help me understand what are they expecting from me as a leader? What are they expecting from me as an organization? So what are your views on that?
Those standards tend to be set by the organizational leadership, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at an organization, typically leadership says, here's how we will operate. Here's our vision, our mission statement. So this is the standards that we set for our external stakeholders, but also
Mm-hmm.
here's what internal stakeholders can expect us to operate from. And when those are properly in place, then no one has to guess how they should show up, how they should lead. And I say, based on a meme I saw someplace, so I can't give proper attribution, but it said, learn to be the thermostat, not the thermometer.
What a
And so
beautiful
leaders
analogy.
should be setting the temperature and not just in the room telling people it's not warm enough, it's not cold enough. Yes, leaders set the temperature, and then employees will respond and tell you if you're leading in the right direction. Now, that may be very different in an organization that's based in tech, than one
Yeah.
that's based in finance, than one that's based in academia, than one that's based in medical. So each one has to set their own tone.
Yeah. And also, as you mentioned about the thermostat analogy, what a beautiful analogy. And accordingly, the way people are responding, I should be able to regulate it up or down. I should be willing to tune it up or tone it down. And also, it brings a word called co-creation for me. So I think going back to your analogy of command to control, I should be willing to move to co-creation and allowing my team members to feed me if they are feeling comfortable with the temperature in the room.
That is so true. Today, collaboration goes far more, collaboration and co-creation, as you mentioned, far further than command and control. Now, here's the other reason command and control doesn't work the way it used to. At one point in the manufacturing world, in the agricultural society, right, we've moved from those types of societies to a knowledge-based society. So in the cases, command control worked really well when you were the biggest and the strongest on the manufacturing line. It worked really, really well when you were the smartest person who knew something. You got promoted because you were the smartest. Now people understand that no, in the knowledge economy, everybody has access to data. Data is in abundance. So this idea in the past, you used to be able to hold it, and if you held it in, then you could keep me from getting the job. That doesn't work anymore because technology has changed that dynamic. And so a leader can no longer know everything, neither should they be expected to know everything. That in and of itself demands that a leader be more collaborative and more co-creative because they simply can't possibly know everything in the digital society we live in today.
Yeah. I just love it when you said a leader is not even expected to know everything.
No.
I just love it. How comfortable a leader be with that? That's another question. How comfortable are you to be in a place where you can say, you know what, I don't know everything, and I'm okay with that.
Some leaders are not. And that's where coaching comes in. Some leaders still believe they must know everything, and they put this undue pressure on themselves. Because all of our lives, we have been rewarded for what we know. We graduated from school. We got awards. We passed the scholastic exams, the SATs, or whatever they may be, and people rewarded us for what we knew. And so to come into a place of ambiguity where we don't know something can be very uncomfortable for a leader. But I tell leaders when working with them to consider, if you always know everything, have you really grown? We must get to a point where we don't know, because that's where learning takes place. New learning, new skills, new competencies are only required if you're going to do something different. And that's where even when individuals talk about, I feel like an imposter because they got a promotion and now they feel like, well, they're going to find out I'm not as smart as they think I am. And Dr. Ruth Goshen said in her work in Psychology Today, only successful people suffer from the imposter syndrome. Because people who haven't accomplished anything, they never feel that way. They have no reason to feel like an imposter.
Beautiful. What a beautiful example that you have shared, Eddie. And I'm just wondering, people that I have dealt with, people I have coached in my practice, people who are dealing with imposter syndrome, they might have some assumption that they should be knowing a lot of things or they should know everything, apart from the other assumption that they might have. And how can one coach that leader that would allow her to, one, identify this assumption, accept this assumption, and move beyond that? Is there any special secret sauce that you have?
There's no secret sauce. When leaders manifest these feelings in words, or it has shown up because other people have provided feedback in a 360 assessment, or some other way we've received that data point, I work with that leader uniquely as to what has brought them to that state of mind.
Mm.
And we open up the coaching toolkit and use the right tools to help that leader arrive where they need to be and the environment they need to be so they can show up the right way at the right time for the right people for the right reasons.
Yeah. So what I'm listening right now is it's extremely important for a coach to assist the coachee to identify what has brought them to that assumption. And if you can
Mm-hmm.
identify that, that could be a good opening for the leader to explore what might be possible from that tunnel. Thank you, Eddie. Eddie, you spoke about tension and friction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, because there are multi generations working in an organization, what it also means is that they bring different set of values, they bring different set of needs in the conversation, in the culture. They bring in different set of context that they were born into and what they're bringing in the organization. They also bring in different ways of expressing themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now, because of that, the natural consequence, if I may use the word natural, I'm not sure, the consequence is tension, friction. What are the ways to address that possible tension, friction, conflict that might emerge from the multi-generational approach to work?
To start by thinking about even how people think about the word coaching. Coaching was once just a phrase used literally in the days of a stagecoach, where
Mm,
a device took people from one place to another. Well, then we got into this area of sports coaching. Sports coaching, where the coach, really sometimes can be a bit abrasive in how they speak to the people they're
mm,
coaching. And then down to the first time where Tim Galloway introduced it as a mechanism to help be used in business. And
yeah.
so helping individuals understand what coaching really is can go a long way to having discussions with individuals to reduce friction, strife, tension about leadership. So as we look at how coaching in itself has changed definitions, so has leadership. We said we went from command and control to you should be a little bit more collaborative, co-creation. There's other leadership theories that exist.
Mm,
So from servant leadership to transformational leadership, or as I often quote Robin Sharma or Keith Ferrazzi, who have picked up on the work of Dr. Ronald Heifetz and this
mm,
idea of leading without titles, that you don't have to have formal leadership where you have a title in an organization to
mm,
still lead. Dr. Heifetz at the Harvard Kennedy School calls it in his adaptive leadership framework formal versus informal.
mm,
Informal leadership means I don't have a title, but I
mm.
still can lead. And to the extent that I receive proper coaching, I can lead even better. But we find that a lot of people are able to do this without permission and then later on end up with formal leadership capacity or authority.
Mm.
But not always is it something that someone has to wait to be given to them.
Yeah, yeah. I love it when you're talking about the formal and the informal, and any reference to Ronald Heifetz, I think, brings a smile on my face. I personally admire the work of Heifetz, especially the adaptive leadership. You know, in your experience, Eddie, what do you think? What is the biggest hurdle a leader faces when dealing with Generation Z? What's the biggest challenge a baby boomer faces or Generation X faces when dealing with Generation Z?
We have the different generational expectations.
Hmm.
And so each one has different expectations for different reasons. But we might say that one begins with expectations of what it means to be a good worker, to be a good employee. For
Mm,
a great number of people from the boomer age, because they grew up under that command control authority, it was about how much face time I see, how much do I see you at the office.
yeah,
And the person that arrived early, stayed late was always considered the hardest worker, even if they really weren't working at all.
yeah.
And that's changed today.
Mm,
So people understand today that it's not about FaceTime. It's not about how much you're seeing. Can you
mm,
judge me on my productivity?
mm,
It's certainly in a world where technology has enabled us to be far more productive than how many hours you're seeing us physically in the office. What a
mm,
number of people found is that the pandemic changed people's perception.
mm,
Many people said, oh, you can't do this job from home. You can't do this job remotely. what they discovered is you could do far more remotely than you once thought
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah.
And in
Yeah.
fact, people were more productive, either because they weren't having to lose time by being transported back and forth to work, or
Mm.
because they weren't wasting time uh, being interrupted throughout the day or at the water cooler or whatever it may be. People really were getting far more done. And
Yeah.
so this
Yeah.
ability to have a different expectation of what it means to be a hard worker, a different definition of what it means to be a hard worker,
Yeah.
and then an acceptance that there should be no judgment on this if I'm
Yeah.
being productive and you see it surfacing.
I just love it when you especially you give the example of the FaceTime in office or the FaceTime on mobile. They're two different things.
Two different things.
Eddie, you mentioned something so beautiful. In a very lighter way, you mentioned that people have different expectations for different reasons. Just curious, what are those reasons, if you may shed some light? Why does a generation uh, coming from the baby boomers show up, have different expectations from someone who's coming from Generation Z?
Partially what we referred to earlier. So this expectation is based on life experiences, and life experience is not just for that person's life, but for a span. So social scientists who put this together and even came up with this concept of the generations, the idea was somewhere between this 18 to 25 year window,
Mm,
there's a mental shift that takes place over a large group of people called the generation. So
mm,
something as simple as the language we use. The words that we use change every 50 years in the English language, but even over the globe, I think we can see they change pretty much in that same 18 to 50 window.
mm,
What we wear, our style of dress, our clothing, all of these are part of where we have this shift and we say, okay, this is what's appropriate now. This is what's appropriate now. And we make
mm,
these changes. And now, how might that surface? It may be something as simple as, I was raised that for a variety of reasons
mm.
to use the phrase, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, when speaking to uh, people. Well, today, there's a group of people that don't identify as sir or ma'am because they don't identify with he or she,
Yeah,
man or woman. They
yeah,
identify as something other. They've transitioned. And so
yeah.
they are non binary. They don't necessarily refer
Mm,
to a gender or they've had a gender change. And so I must be sensitive to this. This is not
mm.
something I had to worry about in the previous generation,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
this is something that we now have to worry about in this
Mm,
generation. And
mm,
that's just one example of something that changes that we must make
mm.
an adjustment to in both language, demeanor, and posture.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm not surprised the world is talking about diversity and inclusion. And it's not
Mhm.
only the multi generations that we are dealing with, we are dealing with multi culture. The world is actually gone globalized. We are also dealing with LGBTQ community where their rules of life are very different from someone who probably does not belong to that community, and yet we all belong to humanity. There are certain principles that will continue to remain similar for all the human beings. And yet
Yes.
we make different rules to protect our identity. How easy or difficult is it for you, according to release my own identity and to embrace and accept 180-degree different point of view? And what role can coaching play in that?
Well, the ease is only a question each individual can answer. For some people, it's very easy. For others, it's a monumental lift. The
Mm,
other point that I would perhaps highlight is it doesn't have to be that I make a mental shift in terms of
mm,
what I accept. I can acknowledge
mm,
another person's way of life, another
mm,
person's choice or preference. I don't have to accept that as my own. And so
mm,
if I'm struggling with the
mm,
idea that I must accept this, I'm probably going to be a little bit more resistant to it if I rather than if I just simply say, I can acknowledge this and respect this.
mm,
Two completely different points of view. For example, it doesn't have to necessarily be something in terms of the LGBTQ component. Maybe it's just it's a political component or
Yeah,
whatever other ideology it is. Can I look at my fellow human being as simply a human being that has made a choice that's very different from my own, whether I agree
which
with it,
is
accept it
okay.
or not?
Yeah, and which is
Right?
okay. Yeah.
Which is okay. And do I need
Mm,
to uh, accept that to be able to acknowledge it and treat them as a human
mm,
being? And that's where we
yeah,
get in trouble because I don't want to accept it for me. I'm not going to accept it for you. And not only am I not going to accept it for you, I'm going to talk about you, trash you, and demean you as a result. Well, who on
yeah.
earth gave me that authority? Right?
Mm.
That's where we get into trouble when we overstep our own individual bounds, try to enforce our feelings and opinions on others.
I just love it what you said. I can accept where the other person is coming from, and it's okay if you don't embrace that. It's okay if I don't embrace that in my life, right? And as you said, who am I to put my own assumptions and my own biases and my own prejudices onto the other person? Who am I? Who has given me the authority to put my own pain and my own biases onto the other person? What a beautiful question to ask. Hmm. And while I'm just listening to you, I'm just looking at the biases and the prejudices that I have for other fellow human beings, be it different gender, be it people with different preferences, people with different color, caste, people coming from different nationalities, people from different religion. And then I'm just taking
Absolutely.
a pause, going back and asking, who have given me the authority to bring these biases and prejudices? Isn't this so interesting that at times I'm saying, we as human beings have the tendency to put ourselves in the center of the universe and look at the world from
Absolutely.
that perspective. Mm.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think? Where does that come from?
We often, if not careful, will aggrandize ourselves and put ourselves in a position that we ought not. And I say we ought not because this idea that unless we it's hard to make ourselves do something. How many of
Mm,
us have gone to the physician and the physician has told us, hey, you really should stop eating this, or you should stop
mm,
doing that, or you should
mm,
start exercising, whatever it may be, and we know we should do it. And we just can't get ourselves to take the step we know will save our life or make our health better. And
mm,
yet we look at someone else and try to do the same thing, tell them what they should do. And we're not their doctor, their physician, their loved one, their spouse. You can't even get your spouse. If you're a parent, you have a hard time getting your children to do what you want them to do. You're like,
mm.
I'm your father. I know what's best.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
it's just senseless to think that we can go to another human being and force upon them our way of life or our opinion. Certainly uh, we see that far often than perhaps we like.
Just picking up the analogy on, and the word which is coming to me is addictive. How addictive is the identity that I've created for myself that I'm important is important to me.
Hmm?
And I think that drives the control. I would like to control all the sweets in front of me. At the same time, I would like to control that people should behave the way I'm asking them to behave because I think in my mind I'm important. And then the control and the command comes in the game, and possibly picking up the same analogy into the multi-generation that we have been talking about. And that stays with me and requires a lot of introspection within ourselves. One of the few or one of the many ways is conversations with self, the inquiry, right? Further, taking it to the next level, similarly, if I can learn how to have a conversation with someone from a different generation, that will help me to reduce and let go of the biases that I have created in my mind or the differences that I have created in my mind. What do you think? How can we encourage intergenerational exchanges in an organization that might allow the organization to create a more conducive culture?
Intergenerational communication in an organization can be stimulated in a number of ways.
Hmm.
Number one, it begins with a mentorship, a mentorship where perhaps older, more experienced employees are able to pass on knowledge and wisdom about the institution, about
Hmm.
life, about business. And you reverse that where the younger generation who understands technology adopts that senior executive, older person in the organization, teaches them about the technologies. It could be something as simple as their actual mobile device, the computer, that tablet, or it becomes, hey, here are the tools we use, these applications that facilitate effective communication across the organization. So this communication tool for instant messaging, this tool that we use for posting content that in the prior years may have been done through pen and paper. Here's how we have it instantly, and here's how we keep this in a repository that we can always access. And this becomes our knowledge base where we all can grow. Because part of the advantage of having 5 generations in the workforce is the institutional capital. And when they leave, when they retire, that goes away. But by getting them to use this central portal, you are able to keep that access in-house and create a bigger collective brain for collective intelligence for co-creation.
What a beautiful analogy. I think the store that you're talking about is the knowledge base that we're talking about. Unless we promote that, we'll not be able to keep the knowledge in the organization. And tomorrow it might create a breakdown.
Yes.
And are there any systems and processes that we need to bring in the organization? Or is there any mental shift that we need to talk about? Any special toolkit? What's your take?
Well, mentorship is one of the oldest ways of passing on knowledge, where someone senior teaches someone else. Yeah. There's tools for that now, but the traditional way of just the transfer of knowledge from head to heart via oral communication through showing physically tactile still exists, obviously. Then, of course, you can use technology apps. As the saying goes, there's an app for that. So there's an app for all that as well. But then there's the importance of understanding the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. Mentorship is that person passing on that direct knowledge, but they may not be able to open the door to get you where they've taught you what you can do. That's where a sponsor, someone more senior, comes in. That person who's in the room when you're not, when the decisions are being made, that brings up your name, that promotes you, that sells you, that speaks for you. You need both. You need a sponsor and a mentor. Now, both of those are uniquely different from a coach.
Yeah.
So you still need to be successful. The most successful Black woman on Wall Street, Carla Harris, she says you can go a long time in your career without having a mentor, but you won't go anywhere without a sponsor. And so I would footnote what she says and say you won't go anywhere without a coach as well.
And that brings me to a question. What traits do I need to look for when I'm looking for a coach? What traits should I be looking for when I'm looking for a mentor? What traits should I be looking for when I'm looking for a sponsor?
I think the traits are unique to each individual, where you will feel comfortable, where you're going to feel chemistry. But uniquely, I would perhaps say, I'm sorry, not uniquely, universally, what many people perhaps want is someone who has the credential. Now, for some, the credential means they have a formal credential as a coach where they've gotten a passed an exam, both written and performance, through an organization like the International Coaching Federation. For others, it may be that they've got the credential of coaching just because they have life experience, where there may be a senior HR professional or a director in the organization who's not certified, but they're using a coaching approach for all their interactions with the employees. In fact, the program I used to teach at the Association for Talent Development, or ATD, that's what I promoted. We were teaching people who weren't certified coaches, but they were directors, senior vice presidents and such in organizations. They were leaders who wanted to have a coaching approach. They want to be a coach first, leader second, recognizing that active listeners, those who are curious, and those who help other people figure out the problem versus telling the answer will be far more successful than those taking the traditional approach to leadership.
And what traits would you look for a mentor and a sponsor?
And a mentor, you're looking for someone who's done it before, someone who has a coaching approach. A sponsor, you're looking for that person that has organizational capital, organizational authority, because you need that person who's in a position who's willing to then spend that on you. And that's why I said the
Mm.
mentor, they may know what to do. Hey, this worked for
Yeah.
me. This can work for you. But they don't have the access to get you through the door. That person in a position of sponsorship, they've got authority. People listen to them. They're a decision maker, or they're with the key decision makers. So you need a person that has that, and now they take that capital, spend it on you. They're willing to put their good name on you to get you where the mentor developed you to be able to get.
Yeah, yeah. What a beautiful analogy, you know. The word sponsor was not available in my dictionary. And I think thank you so much. For me, this is one of the highest uh, key takeaways that coaching and mentoring, I've been playing with that. But I think the way you're bringing in the sponsoring, the third element to it, I think that is really important. Eddie, what according to you that a coach needs to go through, or what is a way that a coach can prepare herself to work with multi-generational workforce in today's era?
Coaches can prepare themselves to be able to work with multiple generations by continuing to grow themselves. Recognize, number one, what generation you're in and what characteristics. We don't just label people with broad brushstrokes, if you will, but we want to understand what are the dynamics typically innate to that group. Much the way we do with anyone when we're traveling to another country to visit. If I'm going to go to this country, here's some things I need to know when I go there so I'm not offending anyone. So as a coach, are we keeping up with the latest white papers released by whatever institution we want to be a part of? So if we're part of the EMCC or the IOC or IAC, all these different coaching organizations, am I keeping up with the white papers? Am I going to the conferences? Am I coming here to Ericsson and X-Monks and being a part of these sessions that are held and the great work that Gaurav and his team are doing across the globe? Educating ourselves as coaches is so important. We can't get complacent. Just like we tell our clients, we must keep growing. We must keep leading if we're going to be successful as a coach using coaching across generations.
Yeah. Thank you, Eddie, for re-emphasizing on the need that how it's so important for us as coaches to be on the path of self-development, be it going internally and exploring your own values, exploring your own biases, your own prejudices, and looking at where am I coming from. Also growing horizontally to continue to add more skill set and read more articles and interact with more coaches, learn from fellow travelers and attend seminars and attend webinars and be a part of different conferences. Eddie, thank you so much for all your insights and sharing your wisdom with our audience. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here, and I look forward to interact with you more often. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaurav. And for anyone who wants to connect with me on social media, I welcome them to connect with me. Visit linkageinc.com or askeddieturner.com, and you can contact me and get my social links there.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.